Chapter 82, Getting Advice. Sometimes, he could not help but observe a person even though he had clearly lost all hope in that person. He wanted to see if this person had come to his senses and if there were any positive changes. Professor Luo Shifeng was such a person. He had been a little disappointed with Zhu Tui, who always sat and rested when he heard Zhu Tui's questions just now. Look at the 1,500 students in the court. Even the female students who had cried because of the injection clenched their teeth and persevered with the training. Why would a man like him frequently sit down and rest? This was especially so for Professor Luo, who saw Zhu Tui sitting down when he returned to the podium. He did not stand up. He became even angrier. Even the red date swill in front of him no longer smelled good. There were a few times when Professor Luo wanted to scold Zhu Tui. He had to lecture this student who had no willpower at all. However, he ultimately restrained himself. 1. It would affect the attention of the other students and affect their training. Secondly, he wanted to see just how long Zhu Tui would be resting. Is he going to sleep? He was not angry if he did not watch him. The more he watched, the angrier he got. Professor Luo was shocked to notice that Zhu Tui had closed his eyes. Judging from his even breathing, he had really been sleeping. He really thinks that he can sleep in my classes. Professor Luo had already decided that he would give Zhu Tui a little more screen time after the lecture. Soon, another hour passed. Zhu Tui, who had slept for nearly an hour, suddenly stood up. He closed his eyes and stood silently for a few minutes. He once again activated the switch of the high-frequency sensory laser. He began training his reflexes. However, Professor Luo did not care about that anymore. He had already decided to give Zhu Tui a hard time after class. As they were far away, Professor Luo could not see the results of Zhu Tui's training. However, Zhu Tui's eyes were filled with surprise. 120 milliseconds. The speed of his reflexes suddenly increased to 120 milliseconds. It was an increase of 60 milliseconds from the initial test results. That was the effect of activating a reflexes-related genetic base point during the hour just now. Furthermore, the effects of the level F energy restoration pills were too weak. Even 10 of them could not compare to a bottle of level E energy restoration elixir. Otherwise, it would be faster. The reflexes-related genetic base points that he activated were located at his spine. The effects were startling. Furthermore, he had just activated the genetic base point. His reaction speed would increase after some training. Before the stimulant wears off, I want to label the 9 genetic base points I found that are related to reaction speed. With that thought, Zhu Tui sat down again and entered the illusory introspection. He marked the genetic base points. Professor Luo Shifeng, who had been paying attention to Zhu Tui from time to time, felt his throat turn dry. He had just trained once and had to rest again. What did that mean? Was this lad here to catch up on sleep? Zhu Tui closed his eyes and sensed his surroundings for 15 minutes before standing up again. He practiced 4 more times before the bell signaling the end of the lesson rang. The 3 hours were up. Professor Luo Shifeng cleared his throat. Alright, the 3-hour peak period of the elixir's effects is over. The nerve acceleration elixir will still be effective for the next 5 days. Students, you have to find time every day to train in the building. Remember, perseverance is key. Also, regarding the side effects, if they happen, you should try their best to overcome them. They are usually the most severe on the first day. Luo Shifeng suddenly knocked on the table and pointed at the 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs on the table. The 3 hours are over. Is there anyone whose reaction speed has increased by more than 50 milliseconds? If there is, these 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs are his. To Professor Luo, asking about the reward after every class was already part of the process. That was because not a single student had achieved this goal during the years he had taught the reflex-type course. It was impossible for anyone to do that in 3 days, much less 3 hours. Under normal circumstances, a person had to go through 3 weeks of training before they could enhance their reflexes by 50 milliseconds. Furthermore, the enhancement would become smaller in the future. Improvement became harder and harder. Almost instinctively, Professor Luo placed the 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs into his pocket after he announced the reward. He then slammed the table again. Lastly, I want to say something. Most of us will. Ring, ring, ring. The bell suddenly rang. What's the problem? Professor Lu was a little angry that his speech was interrupted. However, he did not flare up since it was already after class. He became even more displeased when he saw that the person who interrupted him was Zhu Tui, a student who had made him lose all hope. What are you doing? I was just about to scold you. Professor Luo, I have met your requirements. My reaction speed has increased by more than 50 milliseconds. What? Huh? Even Professor Luo, whose reflexes were extremely fast, was confused. Was this student called Zhu Tui a clown sent by someone to provoke him and make him laugh? Half of the time he spent sleeping during the 3 hours would also increase his reflexes by 50 milliseconds. Is that possible? If that worked, he could get all of the students to sleep and train in the future. Professor Luo did not believe him. Did I hear wrongly, or did you mistake 5 for 50? Several students laughed like pigs. However, they kept their mouths shut under the glares of the mystery branch students, especially those from the School of Enlightened Mind. Zhu Tui might not be in the Mystery Branch Institute now, but his reputation in the School of Enlightened Mind was unquestionable. Professor Luo, you didn't hear wrongly. Neither did I see wrongly. Zhu Tui was very persistent. However, he still maintained a great deal of respect for Professor Luo, who had helped him greatly. Professor Luo, if you think so, then I don't want the reward. Zhu Tui had a caring expression. Zhu Tui felt that Professor Luo might feel a little heartache. After all, it was $15,000. The salary of a professor was not high either. The veins on Professor Luo Shi's forehead were pulsing. How could he not understand what the student in front of him meant? He was just short of saying that he could not afford to lose, and could not bear to part with the 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs. He was a professor from the School of Neurology. If a student managed to do it, he would have to do it even if he could not bear to. Otherwise, where would his dignity as a professor go? Professor Luo walked quickly towards Zhu Tui. What a lad! He had not even criticized Zhu Tui for sleeping in his class, yet this lad was already causing trouble for him. The initial test report and the final test report. Professor Luo extended his hand. Zhu Tui quickly handed it over. Professor Luo's eyes widened after he took a look. Something was wrong. Initial test result, 180 milliseconds. The last test determined a reaction speed of 114 milliseconds. It had increased by 50 milliseconds. It had actually increased by 66 milliseconds. If it was another student, they would not have such results even if they trained hard for a month and used the nerve acceleration elixir every 5 days. Professor Luo frowned. He instinctively felt that there was a problem with the supercomputer at the Wuxia Genetic Evolution College. However, that was rather impossible. Do you want to test it again? Luo Shifeng said. All right. Zhu Tui did not hesitate. He composed himself and activated the sensor laser. Luo Shifeng was very surprised. He had thought that the student in front of him would refuse or even do something else. However, he did not expect him to be so direct. Luo Shifeng was watching by the side while Zhu Tui was testing his reflexes. The more Luo Shifeng watched, the more shocked he became. With his experience, he could tell at a glance that Zhu Tui's reflexes had really improved. What the student said was true. Luo Shifeng was a little confused. Sleeping for 1.5 hours during the 3 hours training could also increase the reaction speed of a person's nerves? This extent could only be achieved by directly activating a relevant genetic base point. Did the student really sleep because he could not take it anymore after his training just now? And then activated the relevant genetic base points. 112 milliseconds. Compared to Zhu Tui's last test score, Zhu Tui's score had increased by 2 milliseconds during the test that Professor Luo was personally monitoring. This time, Professor Luo could confirm that Zhu Tui had indeed activated reflexes type genetic base points. At that instant, Professor Luo felt a little heartache. You did it! This reward is yours! Professor Luo immediately placed 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs in front of Zhu Tui. He felt a little heartache the moment he gave the reward. He had lost half of his allowance this month. He might not even be able to drink anymore. However, Professor Luo felt a little fortunate. Fortunately, he did not have the time to give Zhu Tui a hard time just now and scolded him in front of all the students. Otherwise, he would be slapped across the face if the student had said it a few seconds later. Zhu Tui, who had just collected 3 bottles of level E energy restoration elixirs, was elated. If every teacher in the college was as generous as Professor Luo, it would be a lucrative source of income. He got 3 bottles at a time. There's no need to give him once a day. Once every 2 to 3 days is fine too. It could also solve his major problem. Look everyone, Zhu Tui has been training extremely hard during this lesson. His reflexes have increased by an alarming 68 milliseconds. In the future, all of the students would have to learn from Zhu Tui. Learn from his painstaking training. Countless shocked gazes looked toward Zhu Tui from the lecture hall. Increased by 68 milliseconds. Was he a god? Or were Thascom? Professor Lu Shifeng felt that something was wrong with the way he concluded the lesson. Many of the students around Zhu Tui also felt that the scene was very disharmonious. They had seen Zhu Tui spend at least half of his time resting during the 3 hours of training just now. If that was considered hard work, then they who had trained non-stop for 3 hours were the worst kind of hard work. But what about their grades? It was too f***ing sad. They had already put in a great deal of effort, yet the increase in their reaction speed after 3 hours was not even a fraction of what Zhu Tui had achieved. This was simply class dismissed. After Professor Luo Shifeng left, several students who were far away started to gather around Zhu Tui's practice square. Do what? They had to get advice, of course. However, the feelings of the students around Zhu Tui were indescribable. Get what advice? Advice on sleep?